Donnie, Law of Self-Defense member Donnie asks, how many states have adopted the Missouri position that display of a deadly weapon in a threatening manner is a use of deadly force, and how many states haven't? I don't have a number for you, Donnie. It's a pretty mixed bag. So Donnie's referencing the reality that in some states, Massachusetts certainly is one of those, when I was living and practicing law there, where the mere display of a gun is treated the same as the use of deadly force. So threat of deadly force and use of deadly force are treated the same way in terms of what's required for that conduct to be justified. Of course, the use of deadly force would require, hypothetically, generally speaking, that you were facing a threat of imminent unlawful deadly force, and therefore you were using deadly force in self-defense, and it was privileged as justified self-defense. And some states treat the mere threat of deadly force the same way they treat the use of deadly force. And I know Massachusetts' rationale was, if we don't treat them the same, if we don't require the same level of justification for mere threat with a gun, for example, as we do for firing the gun, then we're encouraging people to be displaying guns when they wouldn't be privileged to fire the gun. And we don't want to do that. Basically, it's a policy position adopted by the Massachusetts courts. In Massachusetts, really all the self-defense law is case law, court law. It's not, Massachusetts doesn't really have any self-defense statutes, remarkably enough. Other states do distinguish between the two, where they don't have the same requirements for the mere threat of deadly force with a gun as they do for the use of deadly force with a gun. In fact, many states, although this isn't in statute, the prosecutors adopt as internal policy a number of gradients of display of a gun and whether or not it qualifies as aggravated assault. So a lot of prosecutors' offices will say, hey, if you unlawfully point a gun at another person and scare them with it for the purpose of changing their behavior, we're going to call that aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. But what if you only bring the gun to a low ready? Well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. It's more wishy-washy. What if you put your hand on the gun in the holster, but you never draw the pistol? Well, then they're less likely to qualify that as aggravated assault, even though by doing that, you're intentionally putting another person in imminent fear of deadly force harm, right? That's why you're doing it. I got my hand on my gun. They're less likely to treat it as aggravated assault because you didn't put the muzzle on the person, even though the statute doesn't draw that distinction. What about if you just open your coat? Never touch your pistol, but just open your coat to display it. Hey, I've got a gun. I'm ready to defend myself. Less likely to treat that as aggravated assault. Again, not because of anything in black letter law, just because of that, it's that prosecutor's internal policy, which of course they can change on a whim on a case-to-case basis. There's no requirement they be consistent in their application of policy. By the way, can you commit an aggravated assault with a deadly weapon without even having a deadly weapon? Now, some states, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon requires the actual presence of a weapon, sometimes an operable weapon. So an inoperable weapon wouldn't give rise to that criminal charge. But in many states, they don't care whether you actually have a gun or not. They just care because, remember, assault is about the state of mind you create in the victim. You put them in a reasonable fear of imminent deadly force harm, unlawful imminent deadly force harm. You've committed an aggravated assault, even if you don't actually have the means to carry out that threat. Now, certainly you would feel this way, right? If you were the victim of an apparent armed robbery, somebody in a hoodie steps out of an alley with the hand in their pocket, pointing their finger as if they have a gun and say, give me all your stuff or I'll shoot you. Are they putting you in reasonable fear of imminent unlawful deadly force harm by making you believe they have a gun? They're not pointing their finger by accident. Sure. Should that be aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, even though they don't have a deadly weapon? Arguably so. Arguably so. Let's see. Chuck, Law Self-Defense member Chuck notes that Arizona has a justification defensive display of a firearm, but as far as I know, there's no case law yet. Yes, so lots of states, when the legislature becomes troubled by prosecutors who the legislature feels are being overly aggressive in bringing aggravated assault with a deadly weapon charges, which again carries up to 20 years in prison, right? Very serious offense. The legislature often feels that some prosecutors, usually anti-gun prosecutors, city center prosecutors, are being overly aggressive, charging people with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, when the legislature feels like the particular case in question was really a defensive display of a gun that ought to be lawful. And so the legislatures will pass these defensive display statutes to constrain those prosecutors. But these statutes don't really have much in the way of teeth, folks. The way they're invariably drafted is they say, hey, if a defensive display was done in lawful self-defense, then it's not a crime. Well, okay, fair enough. But of course, the reason the prosecutor's charging that conduct as aggravated assault with a deadly weapon is that the prosecutor doesn't believe it was done in lawful self-defense. Of course, if it was done in lawful self-defense, it's justified conduct. It's that justified before you have a justified defensive display statute. So the defensive display statute doesn't really change anything. It's kind of feel-good legislation, and maybe it sends a message to prosecutors. But frankly, I've always been concerned that the people who are uninformed just do a plain English reading of that defensive display justification statute, think it's giving them some additional privilege to display a firearm. It doesn't. It doesn't really give you anything additional in terms of legal defense. Let's see. What else? Lots of regulars in the chat. Welcome, folks. Welcome. These law self-defense members make all this possible.